Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Maine's RCV Primary, a first-hand account from the Secretary of State. The webinar will begin shortly. My name is Karen Brinson Bell, and I'm a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center consulting team. I will be your moderator for today's session. First, we need to cover a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a maximum number of attendees with us today. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. To expand or minimize the control panel, click the orange arrow of your webinar taskbar. If you have a question or comment regarding the webinar, please type that message in the question box. To keep this webinar to about 45 to 50 minutes, and out of respect for your time, there will only be a brief question and answer session at the end. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document that we'll coordinate with the Secretary of State's office. And we will email that to the attendees and also post the Q&A document with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website in 1 to 2 weeks. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center provides a compilation of best practices and first-hand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting. The website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, and the overall project serve as resources for voters, election administrators, policymakers, candidates, and others. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center team is not advocacy focused. Rather, we aim to provide resources that allow jurisdictions to implement ranked choice voting effectively and efficiently. With extensive elections experience and working together overseeing statewide, municipal, and district RCV elections, our team has focused on expanding the resources and information available regarding the administration of and education about this voting method. We are available to discuss whether or not RCV is an option for your jurisdiction and to assist in developing implementation plans, processes for tabulation results, voter education, and more. Our services are free and include travel. Now I'm going to turn it over to Gary Bartlett, who's the director of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center and former state elections director for North Carolina when ranked choice voting was used in that state. He will introduce today's presenter.
Thank you, Karen. And thank everyone and welcome to our webinar on Maine's Ranked Choice Voting Primary. I have the honor to introduce the Honorable Secretary of State, Matthew Dunlap. Secretary Dunlap is Maine's 49th Secretary of State and is the first person since the 1880s to serve non-consecutive terms in that office. He previously served 3 terms as the 47th Secretary of State, and he is a past president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. He served 4 terms in the Maine House of Representatives, representing part of Old Town and Indian Island voting district. In recognition of his hard work, he received Maine's Public Administrator of the Year in 2008. He resides in Old Town with his wife and their daughter. Karen Brinson Bell and I had the opportunity to visit with Secretary Dunlap in October. He was very generous with his time. He gave an oral history of the beginnings of ranked choice voting in Maine, the players and adversaries. We left with a better understanding and we're grateful. We thank Secretary Dunlap, Julie Flynn, staff, and election officials in Maine for a successful ranked choice voting primary with a modest budget. Now, the Honorable Matthew Dunlap.
Well, thank you very much, Gary, for that very generous introduction. I am Matt Dunlap. I live up in Old Town, Maine, and as he said, I'm the Secretary of State. And what I'm going to show you now, I'm going to go through this probably fairly quickly, is the slideshow that we put together for the public as we were trying to educate people about what to expect with ranked choice voting. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because a lot of it covers some of what Gary just described, the legislative and legal history, which is probably a little bit less relevant to this audience. I think what you're probably more interested in is, how we did it and how it came out. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly on that. So this is the cover slide, which is very exciting. And so what we're telling people about, and this has been modified because we also did this as part of the NAS conference. I presented this at the NAS conference in Philadelphia a few weeks ago. So these are photographs from the actual tabulation process that we were doing in Augusta, Maine, the capital, in order to make this whole thing work. So I'm going to go through that, like I say, fairly quickly. So this was the first time any state had used ranked choice voting in a statewide election. And what the number one question that we got from voters as we went out on the road was, do I have to rank all my choices? And the answer, of course, is not. You can only vote for one candidate if you choose. And what our goal here was to tell people, exactly how ranked choice voting works, is that you can rank your choices. And in the case of the two elections that we were doing ranked choice voting for, which was the 2nd Congressional District Democratic primary and the Democratic primary for governor, that was a seven-way race. So how we got to election day, which is June 12th, this took quite a bit of time. And like I say, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. What we had to deal with this past year was a people's veto question, which started back in November 2016. It was a citizen initiative that was approved by the voters to initiate ranked choice voting. And then the state Senate asked the Maine Supreme Judicial Court to declare a solemn occasion and issue an advisory opinion, which they did, saying that parts of the ranked choice voting law, if challenged, would probably be found unconstitutional. And this goes back to the constitutional construct that says that our elections are conducted by plurality, which goes back to a near insurrection that we had in the election of 1879 that involved a three-way race for governor, which was fine. We used to determine the winner in a race like that. If nobody got 50% plus one, then the legislature would make the determination. And there was problems with legislative races, and militias marched on the Capitol, and it was a bit of a mess. And when it was all sorted out, they did seat a governor, but the legislature offered up an amendment to the Constitution that basically said whoever gets the most votes wins. And so ranked choice voting goes in a different direction than that. So based on the plurality provisions of the Constitution, the court issued a warning about that. So that kind of left the legislature in a bit of a scrum, and they couldn't really find agreement. So several months go by. There are a number of bills that were introduced. The only thing they could find agreement on was to pass a bill that actually did some fixes. There were some gaps in the ranked choice voting statute, including we didn't have rulemaking authority, things like that. So they fixed all that, but they also delayed implementation until December, actually 2022. And if the Constitution was not amended by December 2021, then it would sunset. So that led to the advocates mounting a people's veto campaign. And one of the carve-outs in the legislation was they took the legislative and governor's races out of the general election component of ranked choice voting, which left it really only for primaries and federal elections, which are not described in Maine's Constitution. So the people's veto went to work, and these poor people were out there when it was average temperature in late December, early January was about 6 below zero. We had a lot of snow, and they're out there gathering signatures. They had to gather 61,123 signatures and get them to us by the beginning of February, which they did. And we certified that. And then we noticed that there was a conflict in the law that said that for primaries are always decided by plurality. So we were already under litigation. So we invited the folks that were suing us to sue us yet again and get a preliminary injunction to say that we would use ranked choice voting for the primary regardless of that conflict in the law. So the law court did find that we would have to use ranked choice voting for the June primary, which gave us our first real bit of clarity on this whole thing. So, so we had about 100 days to do this, and with the legislature unable to find agreement, they also couldn't agree on funding. So we had no additional funding to do this. The governor was very hostile to ranked choice voting. So he wouldn't let us use state police to gather ballots, but I'm going to get into that in a minute. But these are the races that could have been subjected for ranked choice voting. This is what we were presenting to the public, were the Republican and Democratic primaries. Now, in the Republican primary for governor, the leading candidate got 57% of the vote, so we weren't going to rank those choices. So we were only going to finally actually use ranked choice voting for those two races I described in the end. So, and there was a legislative race, so it was a three-way race for Republican primary. The winner of that got over 50% as well, so we didn't need that for that. So we had to create emergency rules on the conduct of ranked choice voting with what money we had in our election administration account. We were able to rent a high-speed tabulator from Election Systems and Software. This is similar to the tabulating system that we currently use, the DS200 platform. And the difference is this one scans about 300 ballots a minute. So, and then we had to pay for the computation algorithm that ES&S put together for us. We had to create a ballot design, and when we put our sample ballots out in early May, to my great relief, we got very intelligent and thoughtful questions about it. So it told us that we were not confusing people. We have 503 municipalities in Maine, and the only way to make ranked choice voting really work is to do one cascade. So we had to gather all the materials and bring them to a central location in Augusta, and then we had to get some funding for it, which we ultimately were not able to do. So we had to train our clerks, and the state police were not available to us because of cost and the fact that the governor was hostile to ranked choice voting when gave an indication that he was not going to allow state police to gather ballots. One of our property management folks suggested maybe we put out a bid to some couriers, some bonded couriers, and they actually came in at about a quarter of the cost. And so our two real critical partners in this process was General Courier out of Biddeford and Election Systems and Software, who did just incredible work helping us pull this together. So, and then we didn't have any money to do public education, but we were able to put together this PowerPoint, and I have a car, so we drove around the state and gave this presentation. So we went to 4 places around the state. There I am presenting actually in Biddeford at the public library there in the basement. Every place we went, the house was packed. People were very engaged and very interested in this. And one of the things we had to emphasize to people is that we were not debating the merits of ranked choice voting. We were trying to tell people how it worked. So try to minimize, the shouting matches that would come along. So we also put together an animated cartoon. Kristen Mazinski, who does our communications work, is pretty darn clever, and she found a license for this software a few years ago. We don't use it very often, but it's pretty popular. And if you see the picture of me here versus there, you can understand why I got a lot of crap about how much hair I have in the cartoon. So we put out sample ballots. We had the cartoon actually explains how it actually works, how the tabulation works. And emphasizing that it's different in every state, that we have the 503 towns. We use paper ballots. We have a fairly small staff in elections. We had a lot of help in the tabulation from folks, because I also have motor vehicles under me in the archives, and everybody sent volunteers to help us with the tabulation. So we had to wait till we got everything in one place. And then we had election day. The national press was hovering around. I think they're kind of hoping for a Hindenburg disaster. So they were disappointed in the way it went, because it was actually very smooth voters. We had very few complications for voters. Voters seemed to understand the ballot, and the turnout was much higher than we had originally anticipated. So the way this works is that the towns would do what they always do. They counted the first round. So they would count all the first place ballots, which on election day gave us an idea of where everything stood. So if somebody got more than 50% of the vote, we wouldn't have to use the ranked choice system. So we waited, we gave everybody a day to get those initial counts done. And then it was clear that we were probably going to be using the process for the Democratic primary for governor and the second CD. So on Thursday, General Courier went to work picking up ballots from all over the state. And Maine's the size of the rest of New England combined. So to give you an idea how big it is, it actually, from Augusta, it takes less time to drive to New York City than it does to drive to northern Maine. So it's a pretty big state. They had everything to us pretty much by Monday afternoon, because again, we didn't have any money. So we couldn't pay overtime to work through the weekend. So that's the tabulation center there. We got by the close of business on Thursday, I think we had about 309 towns in hand. We got most of the rest on Friday, and then we had a few stragglers that came in on Monday. So as they started coming in, we started feeding stuff in. Now what you see here is the center, and those computer screens are all linked to one server. They're hardwired. There's no internet used here. And from there, we would download the memory devices from the about 263 towns that use tabulating machines. And then under the cover in the back is the high-speed tabulator that we'd feed the hand count towns, the actual physical ballots. So we had no overtime. We had to take a break over the weekend, and we continued on Monday. There we are going away, and you can see all the attorneys sitting right on the other side of the chain. We did have a couple hiccups. One town sent their referendum ballots, not their candidate ballots. We had a couple little hiccups like that. One town sent their town ballots, not their state ballots. So we were able, because we have motor vehicle detectives who were able to do the retrievals for us. And so this is the bulk of the staff that worked on this. We decided at the last minute to do a Facebook Live event doing the tabulation. The tabulation went pretty smoothly. We had one hiccup with the way we were hand entering the information. We had some towns that were starting to run out of ballots on election night, so they photocopied ballots. So we had to create a record and enter that by hand. So there's my deputy, Julie Flynn, and I actually sorting out some of the last ballots. So the Excel file, turned out if you capitalized the names of towns where you were doing the hand records, the initial algorithm recognized that as names of candidates, and it got confused and it wouldn't read it. So there was 920 ballots that we had to put aside to fix, which we did fix and got them entered into the final tabulation. But it amounted about 1/2 of 1% of the entire tabulation. Over 132,000 people voted in the Democratic primary in Maine. So it was pretty strong turnout for that. So as we were getting ready to actually run the tabulation, it was just me and the technician with a laptop and all the TV cameras, and we couldn't get that last file to load. And I leaned over to him. I said, just smile and make it look like this is how it's supposed to go. So, but we did figure that part out. And it took about 28 minutes to run the tabulation for governor and about 14 minutes to run the tabulation for the second CD. And so we did it in live right then. And then on the 27th, we did the cast vote records release. And that way, there's a lot of demand to see how each ballot was voted and how many people actually ranked their choices, how many people voted for one. So there was also a people's veto question, which appeared on the ballot. The people's veto was sustained, so we will be using it for the congressional federal races in November. And I'll answer questions about that. That's a little bit confusing. We had originally estimated the full Monty for this to be about $1.5 million. We did not get that from the legislature, so we were able to use $80,000 out of our election administration budget. So we did not hire any temporary staff. So this is actually an old slide that we were drafting, but we will get you the actual costs here in just a second. One of the things that we had to bear in mind is this had never been done before, and we were very careful about not putting out deadlines that by Tuesday we'll have this done, because we didn't know. And so what we did do is we told everybody everything we were doing at every step of the process. We tried to be as transparent as possible. So when we had some things that came in late, we told people things came in late, and we provided the data that we had as soon as we had it. So it was a pretty well organized process. We had a very efficient team. Obviously the weather was good. We didn't have any problems with couriers getting stuff to us. And some of the lessons that we learned, obviously we want to have more staff. We want to have, now that we've done it once, we want to have even better training for our clerks. There's Chantel loading some ballots into the center. This is at the old Augusta Mental Health Complex, which has now been closed and converted over for other office space. So that's pretty much what we did. That's ranked choice voting in a nutshell. We're also going to, I think, what Kristen's getting me right now is some actual results that we can show you the spreadsheets as to how that actually came out. And it basically boiled down to the 2nd congressional district race, which there were 3 candidates. There was one candidate who had dropped out, but some towns tabulated his votes by accident, which caused some confusion. Those should have been tabulated as blanks. But Jared Golden wound up coming out with over 50% in the 2nd round. And in the 4th round of the Democratic primary for governor, Janet Mills wound up with about 54% of the vote. So Janet Mills, our Attorney General, won the nomination. So that was how it turned out. And I think she's going to send me those graphics here in just a minute. So so hang on just a second, folks.
Would you like us to play the video in the meantime?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and play the video?
Okay. Chris, if you can cue that up, I'll switch it over to you.
Pulling it up right now.
The state of Maine will be using the ranked choice method of voting for the primary election on June 12, 2018. Only 4 races have more than 2 candidates and will be determined by ranked choice voting: the Democratic nomination for the office of governor, the Republican nomination for the office of governor, the Democratic nomination for the representative to Congress in Congressional District 2, and the Republican nomination for representative to the Maine legislature in House District 75. Ranked choice voting allows voters to choose candidates in order of preference. The votes are tabulated in rounds until only 2 candidates remain and 1 candidate is determined to have received the majority of the votes in the final round. That candidate is then declared the winner. Here's how the tabulation works. Let's assume there are 4 candidates for governor. Let's say that blue is your first choice, the person you would most like to see win that elected office. Yellow is your second choice, and if neither of them can win, you'd rather see purple in that office before orange. So you rank purple 3rd and orange 4th. You are not required to choose more than 1 candidate if you do not want to participate in ranking. Your first choice candidate for that office will be counted on election night. If no candidate receives a majority, the voting will move into ranked choice voting rounds. All of the ballots and tabulator memory devices will be transported by courier to a secure location in Augusta for counting. Let's take a look at how all those votes will be tabulated. On election night, none of our candidates got a majority of the votes. So we moved into round 1 of the ranked choice process. Orange received the fewest votes, so it will be eliminated from the race. But the people who voted for orange as their first choice...
Okay, how do I make this full screen again?
Their second choice candidate will be revealed, and their vote will go to that candidate. In our example, 3 of the people who voted for orange chose blue as their second choice. So blue receives 3 more votes in round 1, bringing its total to 11. The other 2 people who voted for orange chose purple as their second choice. So purple receives 2 more votes in round 1, bringing its total to 9. Yellow's votes are also moved into this round. The round 1 totals are blue 11, yellow 10, purple 9. Now we're on to round 2. Purple is eliminated, but purple voters still have a voice in round 2. Those 7 people who voted for purple as their first choice will have their second choice revealed. Of those 7 voters, 4 voted for orange and 3 voted for blue. Orange is no longer in the race, so those ballots are exhausted and are removed from the count, since these voters did not rank any other candidates. The 3 votes for blue are added to the total for blue, bringing blue's total to 14. Now we look at those 2 votes that purple received when orange was eliminated. These voters chose orange first and purple second. Now we look at their third choice. These 2 voters chose yellow as their third choice. so their votes go to yellow. Yellow now has 12 votes, and blue has 14. Thus, in round 3, the votes for blue and yellow move forward. With only 2 candidates remaining, blue has the majority. Blue is named the winner of the election. Here are a few things to keep in mind when you're marking your ranked choice ballot. If you vote for more than one candidate in a single ranking, your vote won't count, since we won't be able to tell which candidate you really want. If you decide to skip a ranking, your choice will be bumped up to the previous ranking. In this example, the skipped ranking will be ignored, and Spider-Man will be counted as your second choice. If you decide to skip 2 or more rankings, though, we'll only count the votes before the double skipped rankings. If you only want to vote for one candidate, you can do so. If you choose the same candidate in multiple rankings, only your first choice vote will be counted and will carry forward into subsequent rounds. So this is the same as a single first choice vote. Determining the winner of each election will take a while, given the size of the great state of Maine, but we'll report the unofficial results as soon as they are ready, so you'll know who has been chosen for each elected office. If you have any questions about ranked choice voting, please visit our upcoming elections webpage for a variety of informational resources, or give us a call at 626-8400.
And
So
Secretary of State, we'll switch it back over to you.
Thank you
I'm sure
very
that was
much.
your cell phone there at the end, right?
No, it was not mine. Yeah, so here we have, right here you have, this is the web page that we put up for people to search for those types of resources. I also actually have now the slides that make sure I have the right one here. That is probably not the right one. There we go. So these are the actual results. So these are the results of the 2nd Congressional District race that I was describing, but now you can actually see them for yourself. And what this describes to you is, this is how it worked out in the first round. And the blue is the leading vote getter of the round. So Jared Golden had 46.4% of the vote. And when we eliminated the last 2 candidates, we transferred this number of votes and redistributed them until Mr. Golden, Representative Golden, wound up winning that particular primary. Likewise, with the gubernatorial primary, this went a little bit further. This went into 4 rounds. We had a 7-way primary. And this here in the first round, you see the effects of what was written into law, what we call batch elimination. If somebody is mathematically unable to proceed, then they are eliminated in a block. So in this case, it was Donna Dion, Mark Dion were both eliminated, bringing it down, and Diane Russell all 3 were eliminated, which brought it down to 4 candidates. And then in the second round, I believe it was Mark Eves was eliminated. He was a former Speaker of the House. And then the third round, Betsy Sweet was eliminated, which took it to Adam Cody here and Janet Mills. And Janet Mills wound up prevailing in the last round. Now, one of the important points of this is that the majority is determined by who gets the majority of votes of the remaining votes. As you saw in the animation, if people don't rank all their choices and their candidates don't proceed, then their ballots are exhausted. So it's not a majority of the votes that are initially cast. It's a majority of the votes that are left over in the last round. So that's pretty important to talk about. Also, we actually do in here have the costs. So this is what it actually cost us. It was about $71,355 for hardware and software. We had to lease the high-speed tabulator and pay for the software. The courier came in at just under $31,000, and that was to retrieve ballots and send them back to the towns. And then, of course, we ate a lot of pizza. So $423 for food, and that was the total cost of the ranked choice voting sensation. So that's how we did it. And it worked very, very smoothly. The courier was a tremendous partner. ES&S had technicians with us every step of the way. And so there you have it. So I think, let me see make sure I haven't missed anything here. Yeah, the lessons for November. And this is what we, again, and doing some, now that we know how the software really works, we have some ideas about how to make it work for a little bit faster processing. Now that we've done it, we know what training to give to clerks, what to look for, and get our staff working on this part earlier on, so that we can make it move a little bit faster. And if we can get the revenue, and we're going to have a long conversation with the legislature about this, because now that we've done it, I think people kind of like it. So it's probably not going to go away. So there's been, like I say, a lot of disagreement in the legislature. And so we'll have to talk about better funding for this, a better location, and better technology, which is available to us, and getting more technology to make it move quickly. As it was, if you factor in, if you take out the weekend, we got it all done in about just under 5 days, which is pretty good. But we think we can do it a little bit more quickly than that, because when we first started talking about this, we weren't sure if it was going to take weeks or even months if we had to do it all by hand. So the technology has really been a godsend for us to allow us to do this. And we always have the paper ballots, because in the midst of all this, we also had to write recount rules. Thankfully, there is no recounts. And the Attorney General's office was actually handing out the rules for recounts just before we ran the tabulation. So that's how close we cut everything. So that's what I have for that presentation.
We greatly appreciate your presentation, Secretary Dunlap. I'm going to switch over and show a couple of slides so that I can direct folks through our question and answer session, and let you get a drink of water if you need for just a moment, and then we'll go into the Q&A session. So let me switch back to my screen. And all right, so we certainly do thank you for that insightful presentation, and today's webinar has been recorded. We will hold a brief question and answer session, as I mentioned, in just a moment, and the recording and supplemental Q&A document will be added to our webinar series archives on our website. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can also check out our podcast, RCV Clips, which is available through iTunes, Google Play, and SoundCloud. Our most recent episode was an interview with Kathy Monteo, City Clerk and Registrar of Voters for Lewiston, Maine, and she gave us a perspective of what clerks did at the local level to prepare and educate voters about Maine's RCV primaries. So now if you tune in for the podcast and you've tuned in today, you've gotten both the state level and a local level perspective. So with that, I'm going to move into the question and answer segment and unmute the secretary. Or I think he may have self-muted. So Secretary Dunlap, you'll need to unmute. There we go.
I am unmuted. There we go.
You're unmuted. So, well, great. So you talked about some of the things that you realize you want to do for November. What steps do you think went really well that you want to make sure you implement again?
Well, the transparency piece, letting people know what we're doing, because this was brand new. And typically when we make sweeping changes to election law, it's taking out a comma and putting in a semicolon. So this was a big change. And again, I mean, voters are pretty smart. We always like to remind ourselves of that. And we had used ranked choice voting in Maine for the election for mayor. So we had a little bit of a model to work from. Of course, that's just one municipality as opposed to 503. One of the things that we're going to bear in mind here is that the weather can be a little bit unpredictable in Maine in early November. We've had blizzards. Last year, we had a catastrophic hurricane force windstorm that took out power from much of the state for several days. So we want to build that into our planning, especially as we're going to have couriers going all over the state in what could be unfriendly conditions. So this was a great dry run for us that way. But also, I think, just understanding, now that this thing has been litigated to death, and I think that that's actually a help for us, that so much of it's already been litigated, and so we probably would anticipate less litigation into the future that could delay a result or something like that. So certainly we want to dedicate a little bit more resources to this, and that's where that long-term conversation with the legislature is going to come in. Getting more tabulating machines for towns. It's quite a thing to bring town's ballot boxes all the way to the Capitol from far northern Maine, or even out in the outer islands, bringing them in on ferries and even on helicopters. That can be pretty dodgy in the November month. So we're thinking pretty hard about all this.
Right. Certainly, for our team, several of us are from North Carolina when we had a very short window of time and few resources as well. So we were having flashbacks, I think, as we watched everything unfold for you. And it's nice to hear some of the modernization that you want to put in place for elections that, would you say, are also good practices for elections in general, not just for ranked choice voting?
I would say so. I mean, this is when we really were faced, we're in the corner on this, and we had about 100 days to do all this. We realized that we were working with already pretty good material. We already have a pretty strong body of election law that's been very carefully thought out by the legislature. The legislature often doesn't get the credit it deserves for writing really strong election laws. I think we have some of the best election laws in the country. They're very geared towards access for the voter and security and transparency. And we have really incredible town clerks who are very, very devoted. You mentioned Kathy Monteo. She's one of the best. But we have clerks from all over the state of Maine. Their offices are the nerve center of their communities. So working from that, even though we were in what we called the Apollo 13 scenario with no funding from the legislature and very little to work with, we already had a pretty strong recipe for success, especially with the partners that we had in General Courier and ES&S. They've been a great vendor. They've been great vendors for us. They provided us. This would not have been possible 10 years ago. Let's be honest about that. Being able to come up with an algorithm that can actually read an entire ballot and sort out the rankings from over 132 ballots and do it in less than half an hour is quite an achievement. And so that's a great tool for us. And I think most importantly, the voters seem to have trusted this process. We had no lawsuits after the election. We had no recounts, and people seemed to feel that it went pretty securely, which we felt pretty good about.
Certainly can identify with what you're talking about even 10 years ago, because we didn't have a built-in algorithm and we had to write it ourselves, which is part of how it spurred us to do the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center and to work on the universal RCV tabulator, which we've in turn worked with ES&S and the vendors as a whole. So we certainly know that ES&S was doing their homework to be ready for your election. Can you talk a little bit about how ES&S was this part of your existing system, or were there additional charges for ES&S to provide you with the algorithm? How did that work?
Well, those charges that I put up on the screen, the $80,000, that was mostly additional charges. And, that came in the form of the lease for the high-speed tabulator. They're an existing vendor. Now, back years ago, when we started using tabulating machines, there were a bunch of different vendors, and the state authorized towns to purchase their own tabulating machines from 4 different suppliers. Well, that created a challenge because towns picked all 4 different vendors. So because we print all the ballots, we were printing literally thousands of different ballot styles for different precincts using different machines with different, size paper for those ballots. So as we were, spending our Help America Vote Act money, one of the things that we did, because a lot of those tabulators were older technology, some of it was no longer supported, we made the decision to go to a uniform lease, and we put out an RFP and did a bid process. ES&S won that bid, and so now every city uses the DS. Every city that has a tabulating machine. We have a lot of small towns with fewer than 1,000 people that don't have tabulators. So 503 organized towns, 263 of those towns have tabulating machines. They all use the same platform, which is really critical here. So the additional technology really was isolated to the high-speed tabulator to read those. The DS200 is a great machine. It scans the entire ballot. It does not look for bubbles, but the voter will insert their ballot into the slot. The DS200 sucks it out of their hand. The little clock goes around about this fast and then says, thank you for voting. The DS850 that we leased, like I said, it's like feeding them into a hopper, and they were reading the same ballots the same way, 300 a minute, but much more expensive technology.
Right.
So, yes, ES&S was an existing vendor. They're a known partner, and they wrote the algorithm for us, and they brought us the DS850 and also additional staff to help support all this. So that was part of the additional cost.
And I know what you mean by the advanced technology of the DS-850. If folks on the webinar haven't heard, it sounds like a jet engine taking off when it revs up, which is pretty neat. We've got many questions, and for everyone's knowledge, I'm trying to cover as many as possible. But again, if we need to, we'll follow up in a follow-up document. One that's been asked by more than one attendee is if you could talk a little bit about the process for amending the state constitution if RCV was to could be used for general elections for state offices. How would this be done? What has to happen?
Well, you can't amend the Constitution by citizen initiative. And actually, when the citizen initiative constitutional amendment was written in the early 1900s, the legislature in Maine was a little bit concerned about preserving the institution of prohibition. And they were afraid that someone would amend prohibition out of the Constitution. So they wrote that part out of the citizen initiative process. So you cannot amend the Constitution by citizen initiative. It has to come from the legislature. So the legislature would have to approve a resolution to amend the Constitution. It'd have to be 2/3 of all elected members in the House and the Senate, be sent on to the voters in the next general election. And then it would just be a simple majority that would have to ratify that resolution, and then that would take effect 30 days after that. So it's not an overwhelmingly difficult process. We've done it about 200 times in Maine, but there are some hurdles. And the first one is you've got to get 2/3 out of the legislature. And there was a constitutional amendment that was offered up because one party really did not like ranked choice voting, and the other party was kind of divided on it. There were never the votes to do a constitutional resolution prior to this election. Likewise, there was just enough support for ranked choice voting that there were never the votes to actually repeal it. And that's where that compromise came in to delay implementation until 2022. And then if it was not emboldened by a constitutional amendment by December 2021, the idea was to have it sunset, and that's where the people's veto referendum came into play. So it's a lot of moving parts to the history of this, for sure.
Right. And certainly, what you're discussing are the laws for Maine, and we've got folks from all over the country. But we did get a question from someone who wanted an understanding of, and I think this is something else that would vary from state to state, but he was asking if you could give an understanding of all this happened in order for RCV to be used at the state level. Were the same restrictions in place, or what was the process that Portland, Maine was able to use it as the municipality prior to the state use?
Well, we don't have any jurisdiction over municipal elections at all. Under the sovereignty clauses, the towns run their own elections. So they print their own ballots. They can use our equipment. So they were able to do that because it didn't require approval under state law. So it's up to towns to run their elections however they wish. So that's how Portland was able to do it.
Okay. So, and that's certainly one of those things that varies from state to state. Since we are talking about one of the municipalities, can you share with us some of the efforts that the localities to have done in terms of educating voters and what the efforts were to educate the poll workers even?
Well, and we do a statewide training of all registrars and city clerks every year. We usually have some central location where we do it. And the towns were actually quite robust in reaching out to people. There are a number, in the Committee on Ranked Choice Voting, which was the original proponent of ranked choice voting, they did a lot of outreach of their own. So, where our resources were fairly limited, these other efforts, and I, went to a number of retirement communities and schools, and I gave that same talk. We did our own in 4 different locations, but I also went to other places around the state at the invitation of a number of legislators and town clerks and gave that same presentation. So there was an effort to get the word out as best as we could. But again, the initial reaction to the sample ballots was quite strong, that people, like I say, they asked good questions, which told us that people got it and they weren't going to be confused by that process. They were far more confused by the people's veto referendum process than they were by the actual process of using ranked choice voting.
So I guess heading into November, you'll be doing some of the similar training for voters. Will you be doing other things for the clerks and the poll workers?
We'll also probably be working with, we've already done our training for the clerks and the poll workers, but we'll probably be doing more media outreach now that we know that we're going to be doing. Remember, we didn't know we were going to be doing this
Right.
really until May, when the last lawsuits were finally settled. And there were a number of lawsuits to enjoin us from doing it, to make us do it. It was, I started to don't understand how a teacher in a school board meeting feels. Like everybody knows their job better than they do. So, and it was very similar to us, is that, once we finally got the last green light, we didn't have much time. So now we have the time to actually do that outreach and work with the media outlets to get some of this information out.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the release of results? I've had a couple of questions about that as well, and how those results were shared as the rounds took place.
Well, what we did is we didn't do it round by round. What we did, we just announced the final result. We didn't think it would be an awful lot of fun for the candidates to have 5 or 10 minutes, between announcement of rounds, even though we had the information in our hands. We just announced the final result. But what we did do is we printed it out. We printed out those same spreadsheets that I showed you, and we made sure they were widely available. We put them online right away so that people could see exactly, where votes had transferred, where ballots had been exhausted, how many people didn't. There was a significant number in the first round of what you'd call blank votes, but those were not necessarily blank. It may have been that somebody didn't like any of the candidates and they wrote in Daffy Duck. I saw some of those ballots, or they wrote in a candidate that wasn't actually running for governor. So, a relatively small number of ballots, but statistically insignificant number. But nonetheless, it was a phenomenon that we had to kind of account for. But that's how we just announced it at the end when it was all done. So.
Gotcha. Okay. Did you touched on some of the write-ins and things that you saw? Did you see anything unique to ranked choice voting, or was it similar in terms of the overvotes or undervotes or general participation in voting?
It was pretty similar to how it usually proceeds. I mean, the overvotes were less of an issue than we feared. I mean, it kind of followed the same numbers that we see in a general election under the plurality system, where if somebody voted for all 7 candidates as their first choice, obviously you can't count that because you don't know what their intent is. But if somebody voted for one candidate 7 times, that would count, but it would only count for the first round. You wouldn't count their subsequent choices as separate votes. So, and we try to explain this to people to alleviate some of that confusion. But like I say, the number one question we got at every forum was, do I have to rank my choices, or can I vote for just one candidate? And we got that question often enough that we wondered if it would not be a significant number of people that would not rank their choices. And it really was not that significant. It wound up being about 20% did not rank. They just voted for one candidate. We thought it could be as high as 40 or even 50%. So to that degree, people ranked at least 2 or 3 candidates if they didn't rank them all. But what I heard from folks was that they really liked it. They liked being able to have choices. And so I think going forward, you'll see this develop a little bit more, and I think the legislature will probably put some more backing behind it.
If you have time, I have 2 more questions at this point.
Sure.
Okay, great. One is, do the parties have the option to use ranked choice voting in the primaries? Is it an optional, or is it just by circumstance that it was just the Democrat Party?
No, this is actually part of the litigation. The Republican Party in Maine sued in federal court under the First Amendment freedom of association. They didn't want to use ranked choice voting. However, the primaries are run pursuant to state election law, and ranked choice voting is now part of state election law. So they couldn't just pick and choose how they ran their primaries. If they wanted to get out of the primary business altogether, they could get an amendment to state law that said they could select their candidates by caucus or however. But that lawsuit did not get entertained, and so the way it worked out with the Republicans was their leading candidates all got majorities in the first round, so there was no need to rank their choices, which made it a little bit easier for us.
And last question that I have, I think there's a few others, and we'll put those into that document that we mentioned, but we did have someone who was asking about the use of the separate ballot cards. How is that decision made? Is that practice that's been going on in Maine. Can you
The
address that?
separate ballot cards?
Right. You mentioned during your presentation that there were town ballots and then state ballots.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. That's historically how we've done it. The towns print their own ballots and they run their own. They can use our tabulating machines, but typically what happens in a town like my town of Old Town, they'll have a DS200 for town ballots and a DS200 for state ballots. And the state ballots also have the federal and county races as well. So, it's not uncommon to see them mixed together. So that's why we retrieved everything. But we were able to separate those ballots out and organize them in such a way that we're just scanning just the state ballots.
Will you have separate ballots in November? Or?
Yes, we will. We will.
Okay.
We'll probably actually have a referendum ballot, candidate ballot, and then there'll be the town ballots as well.
Okay. Well, Secretary Dunlap, this has been great. I think we could all stay on all afternoon and talk about this because there is so much that goes into election preparation, whether it's for ranked choice or not. And I think we often term ourselves as election geeks. But with that, I'm going to just say thank you and do our sign off. We do thank you all for joining us today, and especially Secretary Dunlap for his presentation. Stay tuned for announcements about future webinars, including a presentation in September on best practices and lessons learned from the 3 ranked choice voting elections that have been held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.